Hi, I'm Dan Schmitt. I do a motorcycle racing TV show, Team Chicago Challenge. My email is teamdan45@gmail.com. My website is teamchicago.tv, and I have to update it. So, last week we were at Pioneer Village. I mentioned Pioneer Village in the show before that, and the episode before that. So, now we're part two. We're going to be at Pioneer Village. We're going to look at some of the wagons. Got a cargo wagon, a Studebaker cargo wagon, very important, great story. A stagecoach, which is totally relative to Chicago. I'm going to talk about that. And then we're going to look at three important aircraft that they have at Pioneer Village. And then we're going to go to the Strategic Space and Air Museum, which is located between Omaha, Nebraska and Lincoln, Nebraska. And we're going to talk about the Doolittle Raid with the B-25s and some other stories from that museum. So don't forget my email, teamdan45@gmail.com, and I'd love to hear from my audience. What makes America great? Just in this room alone, with the wagons, and just shows the explosion in America starting in 1830 to modern days, that 99.9% of everything in the world was invented right here in the good old USA, with good old USA ingenuity, the cowboy attitude, and I'm just so happy to be here. So I hope we'll look at some of the automobiles here. I hope you enjoy this show. And remember, Pioneer Village, I consider the greatest museum in the United States of America. At Pioneer Village is a great selection of wagons. This is a Conestoga wagon. Between 1830 and 1880, over 1 million of these wagons made it across the Alleghenies to the fertile fields in the Midwest. We are now looking at a Studebaker freighter. That's right. Studebaker Company from South Bend was created by Henry and Clem Studebaker, and they built these freighters. In 1860, one company, Russell Major Wendell, required 6,000 of these Studebaker freighters and 72,000 oxen to take care of the business on the Oregon Trail. As we look through Pioneer Village at some of the other wagons, here's a passenger wagon that was used on the East Coast and in England. We are now looking at what is considered a standard stagecoach. According to the information here, the first stagecoach line ran from Clark Street and Lake Street in Chicago to Indian Territory, which was called Fullertsburg back then, which is now Hinsdale and Oak Brook along Ogden Avenue. The destination in the Indian Territory was the Growy Mill. The original grist mill was built in the 1830s. It was replaced in the 1850s, receiving water power from Salt Creek. As we see, this is a standard-looking stagecoach. This is a Walker Frank stagecoach, which sold for $1,250. It generally used a team of 4 to 6 horses that could outrun Indian ponies. As we look at Growy Mill, this is the structure that was built in the 1850s. It is preserved by the DuPage Forest Preserve and Oak Brook. It is open to the public, and when they open up the water line, the mill does work. As we look at Salt Creek, which was dammed up at this location to create water pressure to turn the water wheel that then turned the mill inside the building. The mill was used to turn corn into cornmeal and to turn wheat into flour. As we look through Pioneer Village, they have a great selection of wagons carriages, and buggies. And now we're going to look at a couple of the two prize items at Pioneer Village. First of all, this is a Wright military flyer. Built in 1908, this was the flyer that was demonstrated to the U.S. Army Signal Corps. 4-cylinder vertical engine, chain drive, 2 propellers. It looks similar to the original flyer, but this one was built to carry a passenger. It uses a vertical 4-cylinder engine compared to the original flyer. It had a lay-down 4-cylinder engine. This is a replica of the original military flyer sold to the United States Army for $30,000. And now we're looking at the Curtis Pusher. I should mention that Glenn Curtis set the world speed record in 1907 at 136.36 miles per hour on Ormond Beach with his V8 motorcycle, a 269 cubic inch engine, and then he began building aircraft. He used the V8 engine to win an air race in Paris. This plane here won $10,000 flying from New York City to Philadelphia, one of the many air contests that were held after the turn of the last century. Alexander Graham Bell considered Glenn Curtis as the greatest engine builder in the United States at that time. Curtis went on to build aircraft for the United States Navy, and using this pusher design, they removed that front wing as they felt they did not need it. What great genius we had after the turn of the last century. Orville and Wilbur Wright, Henry Ford, Glenn Curtis. Ford went on to build aircraft also, and they still fly that 3-engine Ford tri-motor aircraft. We're at the Strategic Air Command and Space Museum, Ashland, Nebraska. We're about halfway between Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska, right off of Interstate 80. Traveling around the country, going to motorcycle races, a couple of times I had the opportunity to stop here and look at this great collection of aircraft. The Strategic Air Command is what has kept America free since the end of World War II. What a great museum, what a great collection of aircraft. If you're ever in Nebraska, you should make plans to be in Nebraska to come out here and see this museum. Today, we're going to look at the B-25, which I consider one of the workhorses of World War II. My late Uncle Steve flew one. I've always had an affection for the B-25, and they got a great display about the attack over Tokyo, the raid over Tokyo. So we're going to look at that. And lucky for me, we're being joined by Chris Chapman, who's a local radio personality here in Omaha, and he works with the museum as a volunteer, and he's going to tell us some great stories also about both the B-25, and we're also going to look at the C-47. Some people may call it the DC-3, but the military name is the C-47. It is the workhorse of World War II. The C-47 is the aircraft that led to the great success of D-Day in Europe. And now we're looking at the B-25. Over 12,000 B-25s were built during World War II. It was first designed in the late 1930s, and it first flew in December of 1940. In this beautiful museum, there is a display for the Doolittle Raid over Tokyo using B-25. Let's look at this display. First, they started training in Florida. They had to find an aircraft that would take off in under 500 feet. And then the crew flew to San Francisco. At this point, they did not know what their mission was. This picture shows one of the B-25s flying underneath the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. The raid on Tokyo by the Doolittle Raiders was led by General James Doolittle, and one of the pilots of one of the crews was Richard Joyce. He's a native of Lincoln, Nebraska. He flew plane number 10 in the raid. Jimmy Doolittle was too young to fight in World War I. He got a PhD in aeronautic engineering. He was an aircraft racer. He left the military in 1930, and he rejoined in 1940. A few of the aircraft that were looked at for the raid include the Douglas B-23, but it was a tail dragger and its wingspan was too great. The Douglas B-18 was too old, too slow, and had a limited range. The Martin B-26 took too much room to take off, and it had technical problems. So the B-25 became the aircraft of choice for this raid. The Hornet was one of the aircraft carriers that was out to sea when Pearl Harbor was attacked. USS Hornet was chosen for this raid. The B-25s were loaded on the deck, as you can see in this model. The B-25 could take off in 500 feet, and it could carry a bomb load of 2,000 pounds. The plan was for the Hornet, along with its task force, which included 2 heavy cruisers, 4 destroyers, and a tanker, to sail to a point 400 miles to the east of Japan. As we look at that cockpit of the B-25 on display, at that point the planes would begin to launch at 5 o'clock in the evening so that they can make the raid at dusk. But the task force was spotted by a Japanese patrol ship. As we look at the navigator post on this configuration of the B-25, the navigator was located right behind the pilot and the co-pilot. The bomb bay could only carry 2,000 pounds of bomb, but that met the requirement. As we look inside this B-25, we can see the 2 positions for the side gunners, and we look back towards the tail gunner. As we look at the tail gunner position, from the front of the plane, you can see the location for the bombardier. Now, the bombardier on these B-25s did not have the advantage of using the Norton bomb sight. And now to explain a little bit more about the raid over Tokyo, we are joined by Chris Chapman.
So we're here at the B-25 exhibit and the Doolittle exhibit at the Strategic Air and Space Museum. And the B-25 was instrumental in that raid because they took the 16 B-25s, they put them on the USS Hornet, and they took them over to Japan. And about 700 miles out, they were spotted by a Japanese fishing trawler. And at that point, Doolittle said, we're still a go, but we need to lighten these planes up even more. So what they did was they took everything that wasn't important, guns, you name it. It was taken off the aircraft, and all they had were gas, crews, and bombs. And at that point, one of the airmen piped up and said, well, if we fly over Japan without any guns, we're going to get strafed right out of the air. And one of the pilots came up with an idea to put broomsticks out the gun portholes, and that is how they flew over Japan, with broomsticks as guns. Now, the B-25 itself was a pretty stable aircraft. Most of them did make the trip, no problem. One did get shot down here, one did get shot down there, one ended up in Russia, as a matter of fact. But most of them did make their way, they did their bombing run, and it was really just a strategic bomb run for us. Not so much from a damage standpoint, but from a psychological standpoint. So at that point, the Japanese knew we, the Americans, were coming, and that they couldn't continue to go out into the Pacific as much as they were. The rise of the Japanese Empire right there was stopping, and they were going to have to bring a lot of resources back into the homeland.
I should point out as we look at these two B-25s that Pearl Harbor was December 7, 1941. We declared war on Japan December 21st, 1941. They put this raid together by April 18th, 1942.
Well, the B-25 was a light to medium bomber, and it could carry about 3,000 pounds internally, 4,000 with hard points. Had a crew of 3 to 6, and it could fly, medium missions. The reason they really chose it for the Doolittle Raid was that they needed a bomber that could take off in a short distance. And originally, they couldn't take off in 500 feet. The pilots themselves didn't know why they were trying to take off in 500 feet. So when they were in Florida actually doing their testing, they would just go over that line constantly. And you've seen it in a couple of movies. But they finally did get to that 500-foot mark because the airplane was light enough and it was powerful enough with the twins on it. So when they took them out to San Francisco to put them on the Hornet, the pilots at that point knew, okay, now we know why 500 feet. They still didn't know why. And that day, when they were leaving the harbor heading out towards Japan, the Japanese had no idea we were coming. And we have a theory about that here at the museum. There was no CNN.
As we look at this map on the wall, you can see it was 750 miles to Tokyo from the Hornet, then another 700 to 800 miles to Chinese Free Territory. And Chris is going to explain a little bit further.
So originally, 700 miles out is where the planes launched from the USS Hornet. Now, they were supposed to be 450. And as you can see from the map, they would make their way here over Japan, drop their ordnance, and then they would come down here to Chuchao, refuel, and come over to Chongqing, and they would give the aircraft to the Flying Tigers from the Chinese Air Force. Now, a lot of this space right here, this area was occupied by the Japanese. So when the pilots did their raid, there were two things working against them that night. First thing was, out here in the sea was a huge storm. So they were flying through rain, through thunder at night. The second thing was down here in Chuchao, they were waiting for a beacon. And unfortunately, for a couple of reasons, that beacon wasn't on that night. So they were flying blind into occupied territory by the Japanese through a storm, hoping to find friendly territory. Now, a few of them did. Some of them crash landed early. One ended up in Russia. And 4 of those were executed, unfortunately, and some did lose their lives. But most of the Doolittle Raiders did make it back to the United States, thanks to Chinese nationals. So again, all in all, the raid itself was one of those psychological raids. Didn't do a whole lot of damage, but it did show the Japanese we were coming.
Okay, let me ask you one question. On the raid itself, how many different targets did they have in Japan? It wasn't just all Tokyo.
There were many different targets on the raid from the Doolittle Raiders. As they were coming over, it wasn't just Tokyo. It was Yokohama, it was Nagoya, it was Osaka, Kobe. They had many, many different targets that they were after that night. And as they were coming over, there was little resistance, which was good news. In fact, there were only supposed to be 15 planes on the entire raid. One of those aircraft, flown by Nebraska's very own Richard Joyce, he was actually going to take off once they left San Francisco, just to show everybody on the aircraft he could fly, take off. He was going to come back and land in the States. Doolittle told him, we need all 16, so Richard, you and your crew, you're going to have to stay. So he actually took a lot of the hits as they were flying over Japan. But most of the time, they just flew right over and they made their way to China, and most of the crews did make it back to the States.
As we look at this photo of some of the crew members that survived the raid, they were rescued by the Chinese back when the Chinese were the allies of the United States of America. What a great raid. What a great story. Looking at this wall, this is a tribute to Rosie the Riveter, the thousands and thousands of women, the backbone of America during the time of war. Over 100,000 aircraft were built from 1942 to 1945. As we see this diorama of the B-29 plant in Omaha, Nebraska, and they had a reunion of some of these workers right here at this museum, and Chris Chapman had the opportunity to talk to some of these women.
A couple of years ago, we actually had the Rosie the Riveter tour here at the Strategic Air and Space Museum. And as you can see from the model here, they were actually on the floor working in World War II. Now, a lot of those females would have been on the floor doing the job of the able-bodied men who were out flying the aircraft in the European or Japanese theater. And at one point, there was a time where a gentleman came up to one of the Rosies and said, "You know how to fly this thing?" And she said, "Well, where's the stick? Where's the brake, and how do I get off the tarmac," kind of thing. And next thing you know, she got in, took off, much to his surprise. Not only were the Rosies building them, they were flying them. They were ferrying the B-29s or B-26s or whatever we were building. But the B-29s were built right here in Omaha at the Martin Bomber Plant at Offutt Air Force Base, and including Enola Gay and Boxcar. Both of those were built right here in Omaha. You can find one in the Smithsonian and one in Dayton, Ohio in their museums. Beautiful aircraft, no question. We have a beautiful restored B-29 here as well. But it's kind of cool. We had the Rosie the Riveter tour here a couple of years ago. They were actually right here standing in front of the wall and in front of our models and to see our restored B-29. It was quite the experience to see them, most of them in their 90s plus, to marvel over some of their handiwork at the B-29s. They had actually been sitting on the line riveting themselves. And it was kind of cool to actually give them that experience. The experience I got from that was just as important as it was to show them around the museum.
The next aircraft we're going to look at is the C-47, also known as the DC-3. The DC-3 first flew in 1935, built by Douglas Aircraft Company. It is a tail dragger, but a very important aircraft for World War II. As a C-47, it first flew in December of 1941. And now Chris is going to give us some more information about this great aircraft.
We're standing in front of the C-47, the Skytrain, also known as the Goonie Bird here at the Strategic Air and Space Museum. Now, the Skytrain was flown well before World War II, but it was key in World War II, especially for D-Day. We had a lot of paratroopers that parachuted out of the C-47s during D-Day. In fact, there were about 13,000 of them. Now, of the 13,000, only about a quarter to a third actually landed where they were supposed to. The forward troops who were down actually marking where they were supposed to land, a lot of them landed off target as well. So on D-Day, June 6, 1944, a lot of the paratroopers ended up scattered all over the countryside, which actually confused the Germans. So when the Germans were looking for all of the paratroopers, they were everywhere, couldn't be found. Now, it took them sometimes hours and sometimes days to find their units. Now, when the C-47 itself would go, it would also carry gliders. And some of those gliders would actually carry troops. But when it came to paratroopers who could actually be inside the C-47, they could carry about 28. And there was also a medical plane as well. So they could carry injured, they actually could carry some medical staff on there, some cargo as well for C and the Skytrain. A lot of people used to call it the Goonie Bird, one of its nicknames of the C-47. Now, during World War II, you'll notice these black and white stripes here. Now, those are called D-Day stripes, and the D-Day stripes are actually painted on a couple of days ahead of time. Originally, Eisenhower wanted to go on June 5th, 1944. Due to the weather, they had to postpone it one day. So it gave the airmen a couple of days to paint these black and white stripes on the wings of the C-47 and any of the other Allied aircraft. Now, those aircraft, when they were in the air, if you saw the black and white stripes, you knew those were D-Day stripes and those were Allied aircraft. Otherwise, they could be spies, they could be enemy aircraft, and they could be shot down. Now, the lines that you see here on the C-47, those are museum lines. Those are a lot cleaner than what you'd see on D-Day. A lot of guys just had mops and buckets and paint, and they would just slap on the lines to make it at least look like 3 white and 2 black. Now, also the C-47 would carry those gliders, and when the gliders would be carried across the channel, those paratroopers would just go and they would land and they would find an area that they were supposed to be in. Now, a lot of those paratroopers actually made it to where they needed to go, as opposed to the ones who came out of the C-47.
As we see this model of a C-47 pulling a glider, I should point out that General Eisenhower made a statement that the C-47, the bazooka, and the Jeep represented 3 items that were critically important to winning the war in Europe.
Now the C-47, as we said, flew from the 40s, but it also flew up through the 70s, believe it or not. An airplane like this, you would think it wouldn't have lasted much past World War II, but it did. It actually flew in Korea, flew in Vietnam, and then in the 70s we pretty much retired them. Currently, it's an airplane you would consider as a DC-3 on the commercial level, and you can see the slope of the DC-3 or the C-47. It's quite drastic. So imagine getting in the rear of the C-47 or as a DC-3 passenger plane and crawling up to your seat. You'd be sitting at quite an angle, 30, 40 degrees before it took off. So quite an airplane, no question about it, and it was really an important airplane for us in World War II, for us to be able to win and cross over the English Channel to Normandy.
I want to thank Chris Chapman and the entire staff at the Strategic Air and Space Museum. What a great experience. What a great museum. And you should make plans to go to the Strategic Air and Space Museum. And for more information, go to sasmuseum.com. sasmuseum.com. For more information on the Pioneer Village Museum, it's pioneervillage.com. Pioneervillage.com. What a great time I had at these two wonderful museums in Nebraska. To contact me, and I love to hear from my audience, it's teamdan45@gmail.com. Or remember, you can always search on YouTube with Dan Schmitt Motorcycle Racing for great motorcycle racing action. Dan Schmitt Politics to learn what makes America great. And I highly encourage you to visit the World of Motorcycle Museum. They're in Winamac, Indiana, 4 miles south of North Judson on Indiana Highway 39. But give them a call first at 574-896-3172. It's a great trip and a great collection of motorcycles, and they sell Harley Davidsons and Yamahas at Kirstein Cycle. And to pick up your copy of the Team Chicago History Package, go to Rich's Yamaha in Lockport, Illinois, but give them a call first at 815-838-8130. Their website is richesyamaha.com. Pick up your copy of the Team Chicago History Package. If you want to learn everything there is to know about motorcycles, there's nothing like going to a swap meet. Here's a few dates coming up. Princeton, Illinois, Springfield, Ohio, and in 2026, back to Princeton, Illinois, and Shepherdsville, Kentucky. Remember, walneckswap.com, walneckswap.com.